Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we are visiting with Michael Abbott Jr., author of the newly released from World Ahead Press and WND Books, entitled To Slavery, A Blueprint for Breaking the Chains That Threaten American Exceptionalism. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shalom.
Shalom to you. Michael is a Christian philosopher, author, and apologist. He's spent 15 years in the banking industry, receiving numerous accolades for his achievements from the FDIC. He and his wife are fierce homeschool advocates, and Michael, like myself, is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So it's great to have you on the program. So, Michael, in a letter you sent to me, you talked about growing up in Pittsburgh, and you went to, I went to Taylor Alderdice High School before I went off to prep school. And you graduated from Catholic.
North Catholic, yeah, which is only about 5 miles away from where Alderdice is. So I remember watching Alderdice was a quad A football program. North Catholic wasn't quite at that level, but it's very nice to speak to somebody with the same roots as me.
Well, Pittsburgh had a very large Catholic population when I was growing up. The Archdiocese is there in Pittsburgh. And so were you raised in a Catholic home?
No, you know what's funny is I came to the faith through my education at North Catholic University. I was, by and large, not a church-attending student growing up, but once I went to North Catholic High School, and the funny story, the backstory, Rabbi, is the whole reason I went to North Catholic was for their hockey program, because my local school didn't have a hockey team. So my parents wanted me to continue playing and enjoying my passion, so they sent me to North Catholic, and you know the way the Lord works, that's where I got introduced to the Bible, biblical teachings, because we had a religious class every day in school, and gradually came to know Christ.
So it was really through a parochial school that, is their intention, but I rarely hear anyone give a parochial school as part of their testimony. So it's kind of unusual.
It certainly is, especially with some of the themes that we may cover later on in this discussion as to where the schools are today. But I was there in the mid-'90s, and every day there was a 1-hour religion class. It was titled Religion for 4 years. And that exposure to the gospel just struck my heart, and it changed my life.
Wow, that's quite extraordinary. Now, your parents, what was their response to your journey?
Oh, they were very supportive of it. They obviously were a bit surprised, I would say, for a 16-year-old waking up, setting his alarm on Sunday morning at 8 in the morning and donning a shirt and tie. And I actually wore a suit to the first church I attended probably for the first year. And they gradually just saw the change it made in my life. And what's just remarkable is that led my parents to the faith as well. And my father was an elder in his church for, I think, the last 10 years. And obviously I now live in Phoenix, Arizona, and my parents have relocated since, so they're obviously at a new church now. But they've both embraced the faith. My younger brother has embraced the faith as well. So it's been a very supportive journey, and one that's not just changed my life, but it's changed my whole family's life.
You know, it's interesting that you came to faith in a parochial school environment, that the family weighed into this, and you come out of all of this with a conservative biblical worldview, not unlike a traditional evangelical Christian biblical worldview, as opposed to what the Catholic Church has, a little bit different worldview than the evangelical Christian world.
Yeah, I know historically speaking, the Catholic worldview, especially in my parents' generation, was very strong on the works side of the equation. And I like to, and in the book, I talk about the pendulum between grace on the extreme end on one side and and works on the extreme end on the other. And sometimes I think people associate Catholicism with it's on the works side of the faith, and evangelical Christianity is more on the grace side. And my contention is they must be made one in order to practice Christianity. But your point is astute. It's not something I think we're seeing a lot anymore in today's culture, obviously. And now most schools, that was a Catholic school, but most schools, I mean, you can't read the Bible, you can't pray, you can't even assemble. Any discussion of the sort is going to be suppressed. But what I find is interesting is there are anecdotal stories now in, I know, Washington State and a lot of coastal states where these administrations are allowing satanic groups to convene under the idea that, hey, they have their rights to assemble. So I just find that a bit curious that we have to support that, but we can't support those with a biblical worldview, which, frankly, our country was based on and founded upon.
Well, we've moved to a system of minority rule as opposed to majority rule. And so the disenfranchised get the media attention and become franchised because of it. And once they have the media endorsement, then the narrative is controlled by the fourth branch of government, media, and people feel that we should be focusing on some larger issues, but while we're arguing about the larger issues, there are, of course, the redefinition of marriage in 2015. We've seen this in my lifetime. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, so I saw prayer taken out of school in my lifetime, and that was really when that was the kind of the pulling the finger out of the dike and the dam breaking down, and paved the way for every other initiative that has come since that time.
Yeah, it is, and my narrative in the book really just pits a Judeo-Christian biblical worldview on one side and a secular humanist progressive worldview on the other. And that's really the rift in our culture today. And obviously, as you're well aware, that resonates back to the early 20th century, at least here in the United States. And I think one thing that's not really taught in schools anymore is one of the comments made by former President Woodrow Wilson, where he says, "I want to make children as unlike their fathers as possible." And to me, you start to see the core belief structure of a progressive, and this belief that 18 years of instruction from parents is a bad thing. And one of the messages I sell in the book pretty heavily is this idea that the primary purpose of education is to shake up the order in society. And that's conscious, that's not accidental. And now you see a lot of the schools reinforcing and encouraging behavior that we in the faith would find depraved. You know, you talk about the most recent, I think it was last year, the transgender issue and letting anybody go to any bathroom that they want. And it's primarily driven by this emotional argument that, hey, we need to be accepting and tolerant of these people, while at the same time completely disregarding the fact that this is opening an opportunity for rape, for abuse, for boys and girls to have a discrete area in which they could congregate. And it's just disregarding what used to be common sense to now support what we feel is tolerant and inclusive. But I contend that tolerance and inclusion, those are just code words for militant conformity, because they're not tolerant of, if I wanted to start a Bible study, they're not going to tolerate that.
Well, what we're seeing is the leftover of the socialism and Marxist agenda, which continues to be the underpinning of the democratic or liberal left that has built this culture of distraction, majoring on the minors, and driving the narrative towards minority rule. We have spent more time legislating rights to a group that represents 2% of the population. This country was founded on majority rule, but yet we're establishing rights that entitle someone else to inflict their will upon me, and because it's legislated, it becomes the law of the land. I don't want my daughter going into or having a boy go into the ladies' room where my daughter is. I don't want that under any circumstance, whether or not there's gender confusion, identity crisis, or something else plaguing them that they are imposing.
Yeah, you're talking about, obviously, and you're, of course, intolerant, you're bigoted, you're a misogynist, and they'll give you all the arguments. But what I really want to send a message to are those individuals who have a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I want to just sell what I deem to be 4 completely irreconcilable differences between progressivism and Christianity. And the number 1 irreconcilable difference is that progressives reject, they don't reject, they attempt to perfect human nature. And anyone with a Judeo-Christian worldview understands the concept of original sin. So that, first and foremost, is a complete violation of the notion of original sin. But secondly, they demand that the faith construct of a Judeo-Christian individual be redirected. Typically, we share our faith expressions vertically. We look above. We look to the Lord, our God, to provide for us. And they're now trying to take that vertical expression of faith and make it horizontal, and now look to the state to provide what it is that you need. And as you know, I mean, that's a violation of the first commandment. That's a violation of the second commandment. And they're selling us this idea that we can create utopia. And that's where I really want to stay on for just a minute here. Because if we can create utopian living, again, which is based on the idea we can perfect human nature, that's faith in the unseen, Rabbi. I mean, that has never been seen in the history of the world. And when it's been most diligently tried, which was the 20th century, it resulted in the deaths of over 100 million individuals in the communist regimes of Tsarist Russia and, well, not Tsarist Russia, of the Soviet Union, and in China. And they're selling us this idea that this is attainable of human volition. It's the work of our own hands. So, I mean, if that were true to somebody with a Judeo-Christian biblical worldview, doesn't that mean that we're not directing our faith above and focusing on the heavenly realm, that we're focusing on the earthly realm? Because after it's all said and done, if heaven is attainable and something we can create by our own hands, then by implication we're fixing our mind on the earthly things, and that's a violation of Scripture. So let me just get to the fourth, or the second two. I've got, obviously, so number one is they attempt to, and they claim they can perfect human nature, which is a violation. They demand a redirection of faith, which is a violation, and then they say they can control the environment. And it reminds me of the story with Jesus on the boat. And obviously he's sleeping and the waters are rustling, and the disciples, Jesus, don't you care about us? What are you going to do? We're going to die here. Christ obviously awakens, rebukes the storm, calm returns. And what do they say? They say, who is this man that even the wind obeys his voice?
Right.
Well, according to the progressive, that's just an ordinary human being. Because, again, our former president said that he can control the sea levels. I mean, and we can pursue this war on poverty. Can we legislate human nature away from humanity? Again, violation number 3. And lastly, the fourth irreconcilable difference would be that progressives believe that people are a means to an end. And we saw this most prominently on display during the 2016 election cycle, where there were progressives actively using homeless people to incite violence at President Trump's campaign rallies. Now, again, if progressives truly care about the most destitute, the poor, the disenfranchised, why would they then use them as a means to meet their own end? So sometimes these are just topics that fall to the wayside and you don't quite see because you're so lost by the emotional pitch of the progressive. We need to do this for inclusion, for tolerance, for diversity purposes. But when you step back and actually look at it from a biblical worldview, it's completely irreconcilable to the faith.
Well, it is. And you've charted out in your book, based on extensive research, that societies progress through 9 stages. And your concept, your premise that you've used in your title, entitled to slavery, is something that takes us back to a 5,000-year cycle.
That's absolutely right. And the reason I titled it as such is we have an entitlement mentality that just pervades American culture. It's witnessed everywhere from the Little League field to the public school system, even to newly hired workers. I'm sure individuals watching this program can resonate in the workplace. Someone coming fresh out of school, spending 3 months on the job, feeling that they've mastered everything that there is to know, and almost coming in and demanding either a pay increase or some type of promotion. But if you step back and use a historical lens, what are we truly entitled to? We're entitled to the default human condition as human beings. Mm-hmm. And it was a Scottish historian in the 18th century that put forward this life cycle of human civilization. I'd love to take credit for this, but I must give it to where it is due. And his research and conclusion, all Western societies start from a point of slavery or bondage, and they progress then through the following stages: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from great courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, and then you start going downhill from abundance to selfishness, selfishness to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependence, and dependence, tragically, back into slavery. So my message in the book that I'm really trying to drive home is we are entitled to the default human condition. We are progressing down this cycle. We are a group of human beings that is no different than any others that have lived on planet Earth. Just because we're Americans doesn't mean we're exempt from the laws of history. And so you hear this notion that a lot of left-leaning news outlets, and I'm not trying to make this a left-right issue, but a lot of left-leaning news outlets, the slogans are, we're moving forward, we're progressing as a culture. They're right, but for the wrong reason. We are progressing, we are moving forward, but we're moving forward and we're progressing in this natural life cycle only to the last stage of slavery. And that's what I want to warn people. There are things we can do, and obviously we could talk about where we think we are today on that life cycle, but that's the lens you have to look through. And I think it's a fascinating study because it's hit us now, and it's hit the Roman Empire, it's hit China, it's hit feudal Europe, and we are next in line. And if we don't wake up, guys, it's coming.
You know, when you talk about this move, this shift, we can look at the human condition in Sodom and Gomorrah and see that this attitude of tolerance finally grew to the point where God said enough is enough, and he was not going to contend with this anymore. He set a time, he said in 120 years, okay, I'm going to deal with this in the form of a flood. And humanity would start over again with the 8 on the boat. And we've allowed for the narrative to shift to what you call cultural evangelism. And I want you to kind of talk about that and how you describe that and address that in the book.
Oh, sure. We just talked about some of the belief in the faith in the unseen that progressives adhere to. And again, my message that if you want to firmly separate church and state, then you need to separate secular humanism from state, because it's a faith construct. It's this belief that we can pursue utopia. But really, it's the belief in the absolute sovereignty of man more than anything. And that's what secular humanism thrives upon. But I want to give an example of the evangelism piece. And most recently, it was just before the start of the 16-17 school year, 2016-2017, the college school, Brown University, so very respected, very elite institution of higher learning. And what the student body president of Brown University did is he launched a campaign to put feminine hygiene products in the men's room. And obviously, we just talked about the transgender bathroom issue. Well, the premise here is that, obviously you've got the identification concerns, men identify as women, what have you. But if you step back and look at this, Rabbi, what you have is this belief, again, I don't know any study anywhere that has shown a man's ability to menstruate. You know, so that would then be, again, so faith in the unseen. A man has never menstruated. But yet, his stated purpose of this initiative was to motivate other universities to do the same thing. So here what you have is you're blending evangelism with faith in the unseen to pursue a goal and change culture. If that's the case, evangelism plus faith, that's the integration of church and state. And here's the thing, it has worked in our culture, it's worked in society, because New York University, Cornell University, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and many others now have adopted this, again, under the banner of inclusion and tolerance, but it's a complete departure from biological science.
Well, you're exactly right. We're talking with Michael Abbott, Jr., author of the newly released book entitled Slavery, a blueprint for breaking the chains that threaten American exceptionalism. It is a deep dive into the dire consequences of allowing the federal government to legislate morality, which in itself is a violation of church and separation of church and state, which says there can be no state religion. And your premise is that what's being marketed today, what's being legislated today, is a form of religion, and it is being endorsed as the state religion, and that is clearly the statement in the Constitution that says that there cannot be a state or federal religion. And that secular humanism is a mindset. It's more than a mindset, that is the religion that's being marketed today, and that although over 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christians, their behaviors and their tolerance of this agenda has proven that the fruit of this faith is not being seen in the legislation that's coming out of Washington. And so we're going to address that when we come back from the break as we dig into Entitled Slavery. The links to the book are on the Igniting a Nation Facebook page and Twitter feed, and it takes you right to the WND Superstore where you can purchase your copy. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, We invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're visiting with Michael Abbott Jr., author of the newly released book from World Ahead Press and WND Books. It's entitled Slavery, a Blueprint for Breaking the Chains That Threaten American Exceptionalism. Michael, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Michael, you are a homeschool advocate, and your homeschool advocacy is really founded on two things. One is what rights you as a parent give up when you send your child to public school, and this new common core that says that the Department of Education, federal level, will determine the curriculum for all schools. And what kind of impact does that have in this entitlement, this expectation set that this generation or these generations coming up are owed something, and that will bring about the moral decay of the country?
Yeah, you've got a lot there. So what I want to start with is to just discuss the state's perspective of its role in education. And in the book, I talk about a 2001 survey that was performed at a California school district in which they chose to survey students as young as 7 years old, very highly charged questions such as, how often do you think about sex? Do you ever touch yourself? Do you ever think about killing yourself? And that survey actually went out with a disclaimer. You know, kids have to take the sheet of paper, the terms escaping my notice, to their parents. But curiously, that notice didn't ever contain the subject matter of the discussion. And so naturally, the parents were outraged and saying, how could you introduce these types of just plant these seeds in my children's heads? So they filed a lawsuit, and then it was dismissed. So they appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And here, let me just read this, and forgive me for reading here, but the Ninth Circuit Court actually contained the following excerpts from their legal determination. And most importantly, listen to this one. It says, parents have no constitutional right to prevent a public school from providing its students with whatever information it wishes to provide, sexual or otherwise. There is no fundamental right of parents to be the exclusive provider of information regarding sexual matters to their children. And lastly, once parents make the choice as to which school their children will attend, their fundamental right to control the education of their children is substantially diminished. So you look at the way the state looks at its role in education, and I think those statements are pretty clear that the state believes that it is at least on par with you as a parent. And that, I think, is something that is not as appreciated in the Bible-believing community as I think it needs to be. And in the book, there's a number of examples that show, hey, here's what the state, and we talked about Woodrow Wilson before the break, but here's the foundation of what the state believes, here's why they believe it, and here's how they're using that as a foundation to springboard as to what direction they want to take education. And obviously you touched on Common Core, but let me just hit just real quick before we get into that. I just want to touch on, why are you a homeschool advocate? Why is this something important to you? And you had referenced earlier, growing up in the 50s and 60s, obviously part of your life, the Bible was welcome. Prayer was welcome in school, yes. And then for the back half of your education, it wasn't anymore. And I look at the public school system now. I'm not making a blanket, broad stroke statement on any of the teachers whatsoever. Obviously, I want to be clear about that. There are incredible teachers in the school system. But the system openly rejects the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it openly rejects prayer. And they refuse to teach financial literacy. They refuse to teach civic responsibility. There's no absolute standard of morality. They refuse to discipline. And they're now subverting the classical education, the classical instruction method, in favor of elevating the matter of sexual preference. So to me, I'm just not comfortable as a father of young children. It hasn't passed the test for me to be able to release my children into this system of instruction, because it violates what I perceive to be my calling as a father, my calling as a man. And now, if you want to just touch on, and forgive me for kind of going long-winded here, but you're talking about Common Core. What I look at Common Core is, you're really looking at a first-of-its-kind attempt here in the United States to nationalize education. Mm-hmm. So a student of history, and I do have a history degree, that was my major in college, any student of history knows that, well, what does the historical track record say that societies who try to nationalize education, how does it work out for them? And I have to look at Nazi Germany. I have to look at China under Chairman Mao. And I have to look at the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, because all three of those regimes actively sought to control education nationally. And that's the direction that our leaders think is wise for us under the ordeal, or under the guise that, well, we have to have a set of standards, don't we? And so, again, they have these arguments that are very appealing. They can be very enticing. Yeah, I think we do have to have a national standard. But if you step back, what does that standard really achieve? And especially in light of the outline I just gave, which is here's what schools are actively not teaching. And not only not teaching, they refuse to even touch it with a 10-foot pole. So who do we answer to? And again, I keep coming back to this for a reason. Do we answer to our lords in Washington, D.C., or do we answer to the God of the heavens above? That's the question that I would like the readers of this book to really consider after they digest that chapter.
Well, you're exactly right. The advent of the Federal Department of Education, or Secretary of Education, was instituted by Ronald Reagan. That's the first time the federal government got involved in education. The very first Secretary of the Department of Education was under the Reagan administration. So it's a very modern 80s forward view towards the states being told what, and the level of redundancy, especially in education, maybe more so than any other part of our government. We have a federal Department of Education, we have a state Department of Education, you have a county Department of Education, you have a city Department of Education. That's four levels of the Department of Education that all are buying into teach basically that will control what is taught, and we're going to go based on the assumption that every child learns the same way. And you and I both know that if there is an institution which is not based and grounded in Judeo-Christian values, that the common level of information that's being disseminated is also not grounded in Judeo-Christian values, regardless of the percentage of the population. But this blind trust that we're from the government, we're here to help you. I grew up, like I said, in the 50s and 60s. I was in the 70s. We did not stand. We were the ones that were the agents of change, yet right after this wave of the end of Vietnam and the ushering in of a new concept, it seems like we cycled, just as you say in the book, we cycled all the way back to a form of bondage. And every U.S. citizen today is in bondage to the federal government for education, for health care, which is this huge argument in Washington right now.
Right.
And
Right.
all of a sudden, this definition of slavery, not to diminish both biblical slavery and the slavery of the civil rights and the horrible treatment of man to man, not to diminish it, but what you're saying is that because of this worldview, this liberal worldview being pushed forward, that America is in a cycle as other empires, as other kingdoms have gone throughout history, of returning back to that horrible state of enslavement.
Yeah, and again, slavery, I mean, it's such a heavy word in our culture for good reason. But so what does slavery look like? What are you saying, Michael? I mean, are you saying that we're going to have enshackling humanity again? Slavery is man belongs to and shall serve the state. And that's the direction that we're headed. And I really love using this argument because I want to talk about contemporary issues that explain how we progress to the next phase of the cycle. And what I'll use here is the minimum wage argument. The minimum wage argument is so easy to resonate with. And again, if ever you see an appeal from a traditional leftist or someone who's a secular humanist, they are so good at making the emotional appeal. So here's the emotional appeal. Don't you think that everyone should have a livable wage? If you work hard enough, isn't it wrong that you don't make money that you can provide for your family? Yeah, you know what? As a matter of fact, you're right. So it resonates, and then you have groups like Fight for 15 start to take on strength and start to march through the culture. But let's step back and look at science. I dedicate an entire chapter of my book to explaining how the party that's against science, it's not the Judeo-Christian. I mean, Judeo-Christianity and science are hand in hand. Now, it's the secular humanists who completely disregard science. But the minimum wage, I mean, it's been on the state ballots 20 times in the last 20 plus years, and it's passed 18 times. But the University of Georgia actually did a study that showed for every 10% increase in the minimum wage, you have a 4.6% increase in youth unemployment. And we saw that in 2008 when they raised the minimum wage 12%, youth unemployment rose 5%. So Fight for 15 actually wants to raise the minimum wage today to $15. It's $7.25 nationally. So that's a 105% increase to the minimum wage. Well, studies have shown, experience has shown, if you were to raise the minimum wage 105%, that would increase youth unemployment at least 50%. And so what happens when you take young people, the 16 to 25 demographic, out of the workforce? It kills their initiative, it kills their industry, it kills their responsibility, and it makes them dependent. Where's dependency? Dependency is the last stage before we get to slavery. And now, I'll just piggyback off of that with, Mark Zuckerberg, obviously, he's the founder of Facebook, as nearly everyone knows. Now, he gave a speech within the last 6 weeks where he talked about, as a culture, we really need to start experimenting with ideas such as the universal basic income. Again, dependency. So this isn't something that I'm just selling as I think this is going to happen. My book takes all of these contemporary issues and puts them directly into the phase of the cycle that we're on, and shows you how we're going to get there if we don't stand up and actually use the voice of reason to start arguing our positions. I am not against raising the standard of living for young people, and that's not the reason why I oppose the minimum wage. The reason I oppose the minimum wage is, first of all, it's an assault on human liberty. You're preventing the liberty of contract between two individuals. But secondly, the more you raise the minimum wage, the more young people you put out of employment, and it even attacks those minorities to a greater extent. So it disproportionately impacts blacks, Latinos. So if anything, being against the minimum wage is my way of loving my young fellow Americans.
When we take a look at the impact, there are certain industries who are greater consumers of minimum wage employees than other industries. So this actually becomes a special interest agenda targeting certain industries, such as the fast food industry, which is a huge enterprise in America, that if you impact their workforce and they have to start paying $30,000 a year for someone that they're now paying $14,000 a year for, that what's going to happen is that, yes, you may raise the income of some people, you're going to put 2 or 3 people out of work, as we saw what happened in the state of Washington. They did exactly that, and we saw the impact of it. We saw that companies were cutting back hours. They were reducing their workforce and demanding an increase in productivity that drove to a higher level of efficiency that's now driving them to examine and test robotics, which will completely eliminate the human workforce in some of these industries.
Yeah, and Wendy's just put in a bunch of kiosks. McDonald's is experimenting with kiosks. That's not because these are evil industries. They're not bad industries. They have an economic decision to make. Does it make sense to bring on a $30,000 a year employee if their productivity gives us $15,000 to our bottom line? And the answer to that question is always no. And that's why you gradually see businesses decide to replace labor with capital investment, and that's what a kiosk is a capital investment.
Well, flipping this right back to education.
Yes.
In a public school environment, if the education system was trending the economy, then courses would be taught at the high school level in robotics and automation and software development and things that would equip for, as industries begin to shift, as technology begins to change, so the dynamics of education would respond by equipping. If you're going to have this system of education, of the purpose is to equip them to be functioning, contributing members of society. And the education system fails miserably. It actually creates a form of exclusivity for the advanced placement student. Those courses are offered to only those that show exceptional ability against a national norm. But there is no incentive to raise the level of the water so that everybody in the boat goes up. It is an elite group that is chosen for such benefits.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak too much on a subject matter that I don't have as much direct exposure into, but the challenge is this notion, again, no child left behind, right? So what I look at a lot in academia, and you're talking about, separating classes of individuals based on a demonstration of proficiency at the age of 12 or 13, as if everything that's come to known about an individual is known in full by the time they're 10 years old. That's just foolish, And I look at my own life and the advances I've made as a man, and the person I've become versus the person I was, and the person I stand for today versus the person what I stood for 15, 20 years ago. It's just so completely different. And again, what the school is trying to do is, again, put people, what is your best use to the state? And that's what you're getting at.
So in this cycle of these 9 stages, you think we're about the 7th or 8th stage in this cycle? Yeah. Can we change the pattern of history? Can we as a country, is there a solution? The normalization of aberrant sexual behavior is only going to drive us further away from God's truth, the biblical standards, which so many say they adhere to, but yet allow very permissively legislation to take place that drives the rights back to the state, to the federal government, as opposed to the parent. What can be done?
Well, the reason that I spent so much time in my book and dedicated an entire 2 chapters at the outset is there has to be a foundation that I lay and explains the difference between secular humanism, progressivism, and Judeo-Christian worldview. And I use the metaphor based on an Old Testament verse, and I know that not many in the faith, frankly, are in the habit of reading Deuteronomy. But Deuteronomy is incredible wisdom. And the verse that I actually based the entire book on is Deuteronomy verse 22, verse 9, which says, "Do not plant 2 different types of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled." Now, that's not just an agricultural command, and it's easy to see how it would be, but it isn't. That command is if you are a Judeo-Christian, Bible-believing evangelical or Jew, you should not be scattering the seeds of secular humanism over the fertile ground that is the human heart. And that in chapter 1 is where I talk about everybody understands the gift of liberty, which Christians and evangelicals refer to as free will. God has given me free will. Well, that's the first great gift of spiritual significance, but what's the second? The second is God has given your heart an immense power to be fertile for whatever seed you scatter over it. And that's why you see the people that dabble and just spend their entire lives trying to evangelize the social gospel. Look at the fruit that it produces. So your question is, what steps do we need to take to actually begin unwinding and walk back? Maybe go from apathy back to complacency, or go from complacency back to selfishness, start walking that back. And the first step you have to do it, and it's incredibly difficult, but you have to start finding ways to uproot that influence of secular humanism from your life. And there was a season in my life where I was not attending church regularly. Thankfully, that season has changed. And for me, I look at the church now. For most people who attend a church, you're spending about 3 hours a week max in that church setting. Now, the Church of Secular Humanism, by comparison, is open 168 hours a week, 24 times 7. And it's open via television, it's open via the media, it's open via the school system, it's open everywhere because they've done such a good job infiltrating society. So step 1 in your life, what you need to do is, how do I uproot the secular seeds from my life? And for me, I still get my news day in and day out, but I don't do the traditional method anymore because it's almost like watching a sporting event. And I don't know if any of your viewers are sporting event fan, hockey, baseball, football, etc. But you sit down and you watch a 3-hour football game. Well, you could summarize that in about a 5-minute highlight reel later. So it's the same concept with watching a television program. Why are you going to spend 3 hours watching television when you could spend like 10, 15 minutes getting the news you want from alternative sources in this technological world that is so advanced now, and then reinvest that 2 to 2.5 hours of your time into some productive activity that would then strengthen your framework and your foundation as a human being? And that's what I've done. And for me, the change has been monumental. I've never been more informed as a private citizen. And now I have a book to show for it that I'm trying to share with my fellow Americans to say, hey, here are some solutions that you can take that are going to make material improvements in your life, and things that you can practically implement in your life as soon as today. They're surprisingly simple.
Well, we're talking with Michael Abbott, Jr., author of the newly released book entitled Slavery, a blueprint for breaking the chains that threaten American exceptionalism. He says, liberty and freedom are hallmarks of the American dream. However, if we don't act now, we will lose them. We are losing them. We must heed this calling that will define our legacy in the eyes of our children. This book takes you on a journey throughout history that lays out a foundation that societies are predictably on a cycle, and that over the course of history, that the starting point was slavery and the end point was slavery. And America is just on the brink of something major changing. We can take this country back by putting our faith in God and not in government. And that was the president's tweet, that America doesn't love government, America loves God. And when that becomes the foundational truth, which is espoused in this book, and we begin to apply it in our families, our homes, our communities, change will take place. Michael Abbott Jr., thank you for being with us here on Revealing the Truth. Again, from WND Books at the WND Superstore. You can get that link on the Igniting a Nation Facebook page and Twitter feed. Take you right to Entitled to Slavery, Michael Abbott Jr., World Ahead Press, and WND Books. We thank you for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
It's an honor to be here, Rabbi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that brings to an end our live broadcast day, but that doesn't mean that the Igniting a Nation Broadcasting Network goes off the air. We'll replay all 4 segments and cycle them through all throughout the day and night so that you don't have to miss any of them. You can also get them at our YouTube channel, Igniting a Nation. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our feed on YouTube. You can get all of the books right there at the Books and Media page, or follow the book link that we give you for each one of the authors that we interview right there on our Facebook page and our Twitter feed at Igniting a Nation. And so until we see you right back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time, right here on the next edition of Revealing the Truth, we'll see you back here tomorrow. And until then, we bid you shalom.